Annie from HoopSisters, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make block 16 and block 19. They're kind of the same, mirror imaging, some of the stitching's in different places, but the basic steps are pretty much the same. So if you can see from far away, this would be this block, 16A, 16B, and this video is also going to cover 19A and B. It's in there somewhere. It's on your quilt map. So let's go see what we need in order to make this. Here are the supplies we will need for the block 16s and also the block 19s. And you will make two of block 16A, two of block 16B, and two each of the 19A and 19B. So you will be needing your two different hoop scissors. You will be needing thread that matches or blends in with your fabrics 3 through 8. Now, as you can see, I'm using several different prints of the same color. Each of your sections and what you're making, and on the first one that I made, were all different colors. So you could just pick one of those colors that you want to stitch there for that quilting. You will also be needing thread A and B. That's going to match your fabric 1 and 2. And also, if you're putting the backing on while it's in the hoop, then you will need matching bobbins for all of these threads as well. If you're going to be adding your backing after your quilt is put together in sections, then you will not be needing these bobbins, these matching bobbins. You will also need water-soluble thread and embroidery bobbin thread. All right, so let's take a look at what fabric we're going to need. This is also an option. You don't have to do this, but if you want an extra layer of wool in there to give the quilt a little more dimension, you can cut it the size we tell you in the instructions and then press the edges to prepare it to be used in the hoop. And the fabrics you will be needing is you will be needing the fabric 2, which is going to go right here. You will be needing also a strip of fabric 2, and of course your instructions will tell you based on your block size how wide, but the strip of fabric 2 is going to be your white piecing that's in here. You will need, you will need your fabric 3, which is going to be placed right there, and you will need your fabric 5, which is a strip just like the white strip, and that's for these points here. And then for the piecing section, of course, I mentioned mine were all different prints of the same color. So you will need fabric, and we call those fabric 3 through 8. So you just cut those in the width that we tell you to by the width of fabric. And of course, you will need your backing fabric. And we will begin by hooping our battleizer. I'm going to write down here 16A because that's the block we're going to stitch out. So start out by hooping your battleizer, and if you can take a look and find which side is the more rough side, sometimes it's hard to tell, but if you can tell which side's more rough, then put that on the bottom because that helps your backing fabric cling a little bit better. So let's get started. Let's go to the machine. Step 1, you will put water-soluble thread in the needle and just embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin. And in this step, we're just going to sew a placement stitch so that we know where to place the optional wool. Step 2, you're going to place your prepared wool that's been pressed on the edges inside that placement stitch, and the machine will sew a tack down stitch. For step 3, we are continuing with our water-soluble thread, and the machine will sew a pattern onto your wool or your battleizer. step 4 through 15 is going to be stitch and flip this area where you see the red fabric. And again, I used 4 or 5 different red prints here, and it kind of looks all like one print when you take a look at it. But this crazy quilt area can be different solids, it can be different color prints, it can be whatever you want it to be. So for steps 4 through, I believe, 15, it's first step 4 is going to be a tack down of the first piece, and then 5 through 15 is going to be stitching, flipping and tacking down until we get this whole area filled. So to begin with, for step 4, we're going to use water soluble thread. But once we get to the next step, then we're going to change our thread to just a neutral thread because we don't want our seams to be sewn with water soluble thread. So to begin with, I'm starting out with my water soluble thread just for this step. And I have all my different strips of different red prints. Yours could be different colors again. And I'm just going to start out by grabbing one of those, and I'm going to be placing it right over top of this first area, which you'll be able to see in your instructions where it needs to go, and probably on your embroidery machine as well. And I'm just going to stitch the tack down. And after I get that tack down stitched, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for this one, I'm going to trim about a scant 1/4 inch away from all the different sides where it basted it. So I've trimmed a scant 1/4 inch on my first piece that I tacked down. My next piece, I'm just going to grab another strip, and this is step 5. I've changed my thread to just a neutral sewing thread, and I'm going to place this piece of fabric right side down, raw edges even, and the machine will sew a seam. And let me cut a couple a little thread tail here. And now what you'll do is you'll just flip that piece of fabric right side up. It's just going to be stitch and flip all the way through this section till we get it finished. And then we can just pull the fabric smooth and it will sew a tack down stitch. And now it's time to trim our block. So we have right here at the top section here, you're going to trim that about 1/8 of an inch. Anything on the curved edge, that's going to have the, for me it's the black and white Beauty Found points to it. On that side, you can just leave about 1/2 inch there. And we'll trim that up later. And up here, let me trim about 1/8 of an inch. And then we can go on to piecing the rest of the block. So I have my third piece of fabric, the seam, and we've flipped it and tacked it down. And again, anything at the top, you're going to trim to like 1/8 of an inch. Anything on the outside of the block, you're going to leave at least 1/2 inch there. So we're going to go ahead and continue till we get this section filled up. now have this entire section filled with fabric for our crazy quilt section. I have my last piece of fabric flipped right side up, and I have put water-soluble thread in the needle. Now the machine will do a tack down to hold all the little ends of the fabric in place, and then we're going to trim it. Notice that as it was stitching over here on this side that I failed to hold this little flap of fabric down, and it did get caught in that stitching, but it's just a few stitches, so all you have to do if that happens to you is to just cut those few threads out and then finger press it, and it'll still stay in place and leave you an edge to trim the block. For trimming all these rough edges, anything on the outside of the block like these, I'll just leave these here and we'll trim those later. Here I still have my strip attached and I have more blocks to make, so I'll cut this leaving about a 1/2 inch there on the block to be trimmed later. So up here we already, as we did these pieces, trimmed about an 1/8 inch. Here we're going to do maybe a scant 1/8. We're not going to trim close to stitching because we do want it to be caught under the satin stitches that will be sewn later, but we are going to trim it about a scant 1/8 inch. I know, not an exact measurement, but that will allow this to be caught under the next piece of fabric that is stitching, and it'll be caught under the satin stitch, and the colors won't be too much underneath there because this is going to be white and I don't want the red to be showing through. So we'll just do a scant 1/8 inch right there, and that looks good. I think we can go back to the machine, and what we're going to do is we're going to begin piecing black and white, alternating on these pieces here. So we'll start with water-soluble thread. For the next several steps, you're going to be needing your fabric 2 and also your fabric 5, which are the strips of fabric that we had you cut. We're going to begin with our fabric 5, which for me is this black fabric, and I have water-soluble thread in the needle. Embroidery bobbin thread still in the bobbin, and the first thing I'm going to do is just sew this little section right here, and the machine will tack my fabric down. Okay, I have my first piece of fabric 5 tacked down, and you're going to trim this off so that you have about a 1/2 inch left, and we can trim a lot of this later, but inside we're just going to do another seam to add the next piece of fabric, the white. You're going to trim that a scant 1/4 inch. Step 18, you're going to need your fabric 2, and you're going to put it right side down, raw edges even, and the machine is going to sew a seam. You're going to want to place, since I have really dark fabric 5, black and white basically, I want my white, which is my fabric 2, to make sure I cover that seam. So if you need to trim a little more scant on that 1/4 inch on the black, you go right ahead. But we'll let the machine sew a seam. And then we're going to flip the fabric and sew a tack down stitch. So step 19 is where we flip our fabric right side up, and we're going to finger press that little seam, and the machine will sew your tack down stitch. And we just left the same neutral thread in there. All these seams, all these tack down stitches will be covered with a deeper seam, slightly deeper, so that you don't have to worry about that showing. And now we are going to trim it. We are going to trim it where we're inside that curved section right here along that tack down stitch. We're going to trim that a scant 1/4 of an inch. Step 20 is a seam for your fabric 5. I had to think about that for a second. Right side's down, raw edges even, sew the seam with the neutral thread. And then we're going to flip it, finger press, and sew the tack down. I wanted to give you a tip right here. When you're trimming this, let me move my camera a little bit and hold this up. When you go to trim this, more camera adjustments. I'm just going to do it while you're watching. Hopefully you'll be able to see it, and I'll hold it up when I'm finished. And I'm going to do my scant 1/4 inch right here. But then when I get here where fabric 5 has the tip, I'm going to angle that in a little bit so that the tip kind of, I'll show you, leaves it a little closer. And that way it's easier to trim when we go to trim all of it on that curve later on. So I think you get the basic idea. We started with a tack down, a stitch and flip, and a stitch and flip, and we talked about trimming. So now I'm just going to continue doing my stitch and flip, alternating my fabric 2 and my fabric 5 until I get this section filled up. Just like the crazy quilt section under here, our final step after we got our last piece of fabric on there was to change to water-soluble thread and have the machine sew a tack down. And that way it'll keep everything in place, and it'll also give us a double line of stitching over here to cut against. That way, just in case we happen to snip one of those stitches, there should be another layer in place to keep everything where it needs to be. So with water-soluble thread, I'm going to go ahead for step 33 and sew the tack down stitches. And we just have to keep the little flaps of fabric in place. We'll cut my thread tail. So going this direction towards the top, you don't really need to worry so much when you go towards the top here, but when it comes back down for that double row of stitching, whoop, make sure that you're holding those little pieces of fabric in place. Okay, so when it comes time to trim, your instructions will show you here on this step. It'll show you that on this side we're going to trim an 1/8 of an inch, a scant 1/8 of an inch over here. Anything on the outside edge we will leave a 1/2 an inch, and anything on this side you're going to trim close. So here's the actual block. You can see I have already trimmed a scant 1/8 of an inch. I have left everything here about a 1/2 an inch. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim close to the stitching on this side. And sometimes when you have that double fabric where the seam is, if you just cut the top part and then flip it open, it's easier to get closer by opening it up and trimming just a single layer of fabric. So I'll open it up and then trim, and you can see because we removed those tips there on our fabric 5, that we are able to cut through this a little easier as well. So almost finished. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and add our fabric for this section right here. For step 34, you're going to take your fabric 2 rectangle and lay it right sides down over here in this corner. You're going to leave approximately about a ½ inch on the outside edges of the block, and just make sure that you have full coverage over the whole section there. And with water-soluble thread, you're going to sew the tack down stitches. So we just need to make sure we keep our fabric nice and smooth as the stitches out, so there's no puckers. Right, on the side here where it's stitched double, right here on this side, you're going to trim close to the stitching. Up here on this edge, you're going to make sure that this is trimmed about 1/8 inch, as well as anything else that may have been left there, extra fabric from the last time we did the stitching. So 1/8 inch here, all along there, and close to the stitching right here. For step 35, you're going to put your thread B, which matches your fabric 2, in the needle only. You're going to leave embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and you're going to sew the satin cover stitch. For step 36, you're going to need your fabric 3 rectangle, and you will place this at the very top of your block, leaving about a ½ inch on the outside edges of your block. You're going to place water-soluble thread in the needle, and the machine will sew a tack down stitch. Just make sure you keep your fabric nice and smooth. And then you can trim close to the stitching on the inside curve. For step 37, you're going to put thread in the needle that matches your fabric 3, and you're going to sew the satin stitches. For step 38, it's an optional step, and it's that step of adding your backing fabric. So if you are adding your backing fabric while it's in the hoop, you're going to take your hoop off the machine, leave the block in the hoop, of course, and take your backing fabric and lay it so the wrong side is against your block. And I'm going to stand up because I'm going to just make sure it's centered nicely around the perimeter of the block, and I'm going to give it just a gentle little touch to make sure it's adhering. Sticks to the battleizer, and then I'm going to flip it so it's right side up. And now I'm going to go ahead and put this back on my machine. And I'm going to peek under here just to make sure it didn't move by me placing it back on the machine. So I have water-soluble thread in the needle, embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and I'm going to go ahead and sew the basting stitch to hold the back on. And when it comes around this side and we have all these little fabric hills to go over, make sure you just hold it down, maybe with the stylus or the tip of your hoop scissors, or just something to hold those flaps down. It's actually going downhill, so we're good. Now that we have our backing on, or maybe not if you're going to add your backing later after you have it sewn in sections, but if you do, then you're going to match your bobbin thread with your needle thread, and it can be any color of your choice. If you're going to add your backing fabric once you have some blocks sewn together, then you can still continue with embroidery bobbin thread. But for this step, one of the important things that you need to know is that this section here, it's going to have to match the blocks around it. So block 19 and block 20 will also have to be the same color. So on your instructions, there's a place for you to write what thread color that is. So since the backing is on, you're going to do a needle down, needle up, and you're going to bring that bobbin thread to the top, and that'll help keep your backing look a lot neater. You're also, if your automatic thread cutter was on, you need to turn that off, because that also will give you a much nicer, neater looking back. So now we'll just sew some quilting. For step 40, you're going to put your thread B, which matches your fabric 2, in the needle and the bobbin if you have your backing added. And again, do your needle up and your needle down to bring your bobbin thread to the top if you have your backing on. And then go ahead and hit start to sew some more quilting. For step 41, you're going to put thread that matches your fabric 3 in the needle and the bobbin if you have your backing fabric on. And it's going to do some more quilting. So I'm going to bring my bobbin thread to the top. And we're going to sew some more quilting. Step 42 is your final step, and you are going to put thread that contrasts your fabric 3 in the needle and the bobbin if your backing fabric is on, and then you're going to sew some more quilting. Okay, so block 16 is one that is in the center of the quilt, so you will be able to trim this using the Trimmer by George tool on all 4 sides. So just take a look at all the blocks that you're making, and basically if it's a side that is the outside edge of your quilt and will have binding sewn to it, that's where you trim 1/4 inch through all the layers. But if it is a side that needs to be joined to another block, you need to remove the bulk and the seam, and that's where the Trimmer by George tool comes in. So it's just basically an acrylic ruler. It has a metal edge that you use to protect the fabric on the front. So you will just take your Trimmer by George and shimmy it in there between the fabric and the battleizer and lay it down, and just do a gentle tug if you want to get it a little bit closer, but just make sure that there's no fabric peeking out. And then with your 60mm rotary cutter, you can trim the excess out of your seam allowance. So you can trim your battleizer and your backing fabric will be gone. And so we're going to do that on all 4 sides. Shimmy that in there. Gentle tug, there's no fabric. And then use the metal edge as a straight edge to cut against. Other side. And the final side. Okay, then the next step is you need to trim the fabric that's left on the front. You need to trim that 1/4 inch from the basting stitch. So you can turn your Trimmer by George ruler over to the other side and get that trimmed up. halfway around the block. And the final side is trimmed up. Well, almost. Now the final side is trimmed up. It's ready to be sewn into your quilt. And I think it looks pretty good. And there's the back. So thank you for watching the video. I hope it has been helpful, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.